Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is John Ugland. I'm a Senior Product Manager for NRG Systems. Today we're going to be talking about NRG's Bat Deterrent System and is it right for you, exploring the decision-making process around Bat Deterrent adoption. Let's begin. Today's webinar is going to cover a couple learning objectives. We're going to talk about the problem with bats and wind turbines. We'll look at the solution that NRG has put in place. We'll talk about the cost of curtailment being really the original mitigation measure employed by the wind industry. Curtailment means to basically stop the wind turbine and stop producing renewable energy. And then we'll talk about methods used to validate the performance of the NRG Bat Deterrent System. There are many benefits brought about by the wind industry. I would say the increasing prevalence of severe weather events that we've been seeing are really a mere foreshadowing of what's to come if we don't address climate change and reduce carbon emissions, and by the shifting to a cleaner energy resource such as wind. Unfortunately, wind does have a very dramatic impact on bats. The USGS reports that hundreds to thousands of bats die at wind turbines, and this is really just in North America each year. Globally, it's an even bigger impact. Studies today show that bats may even be attracted to wind turbines. This image below is captured by wildlife imaging systems, and it shows a bat orbiting behind the wind turbine, behind the rotoswept area, fortunately. But studies are showing that bats are attracted to wind turbines and may be intentionally seeking them out on the landscape. I thought I would take this opportunity to talk about some of the regional interest and adoption that NRG has seen around the globe with respect to bats and wind. We're based in North America, in Vermont, and so I'll start there. In North America, we are seeing a high interest of owner-operators. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife is aware of the product and has allowed trials to be conducted. They are putting the onus on owner-operators to include the use of deterrents in their habitat conservation plans. And we are seeing a shift in the wind industry to be more proactive, especially around bats that may not even be listed as threatened or endangered. The hoary bat is the most impacted bat in the wind industry, and I think there's becoming a proactive push for owner operators to address even non-threatened bats at this point. In Canada, we're starting to see an uptick in adoption in the province of Ontario. All bats matter in Canada. They're counted as a bats per wind turbine basis, and it doesn't matter what the species is, but all bats count towards a limit that a wind turbine is allowed to take. And so we're starting to see some adoption there in Canada. Across the Atlantic Ocean and Europe, things are moving a little bit slower, but we are seeing some interest in France and Belgium. We're looking at doing some trials in Southern Europe, Spain, and possibly Portugal. And in South Africa, NRG has had actually a long history already. The bats of interest in South Africa tend to be higher wind speed flying bats, and they're pretty good power purchase rates. So that really drives an incentive to use a bat deterrent and keep the wind project running. In the past, we've done webinars on the technology itself, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the technology, the Bat Deterrent technology, but if you are interested, please reach out and I'm happy to set up a time to do a deeper dive. The system that we use and we've designed is mounts a series of speakers onto the nacelle, the part on top of the box on top of the stick. The speakers are oriented around the nacelle such that we are covering the rotor-swept area of the wind turbine. And this is really important. We're not trying to exclude the bats from their home and their airspace. This is an example of probably a corn and soybean field here in North America. And bats provide a very valuable resource in natural pest control. So we don't want to exclude them from where they need to be. We just want to keep them away from the wind turbine. So now I'm going to get into modeling the cost of curtailment and modeling a wind project. So curtailment is the stopping of a wind turbine, and curtailment was really the original strategy for mortality mitigation of bats in the wind industry, going back probably more than 10 years at this point. It's known that bats are really agile flyers, and they typically don't run into stationary objects. So if you stop the wind turbine, you're going to save the bat. Technically, it's 100% effective. However, you can be encountering a significant amount of energy loss. There's really two forms of curtailment that are employed in the wind industry right now. Minimization curtailment is roughly the equivalent of a 50% reduction in mortality, and that's typically achieved by saying the wind turbine is not going to run until the wind is above, say, 4.5 meters per second. Avoidance curtailment is really trying to achieve 100% mortality mitigation, saying we'll keep the wind turbines offline until the wind is near 7 meters per second, because bats are small. They typically, as the wind speed increases, bats typically stop flying. But as you can see in this graph, what we have in the blue bars is a wind speed distribution and a wind turbine power curve in orange. And so as we move up in wind speed, we're really consuming a lot of the available wind energy on the project. And as you can see, as we approach that avoidance curtailment level, 7 meters per second is half of the possible production of this wind turbine. So a wind project that's curtailing at, say, between 4.5 and 6.9 meters per second could be seeing up to 3.5% energy loss, AEP, annual energy production. So it can be really significant for a wind project. NRG has developed a few, I would call them fairly basic models that we can use to model the loss of curtailment. So if you're considering maybe a new wind farm and you want to understand what curtailment could cost you, or maybe you don't have access to data that already has your curtailment downtime allocated, you could run a model, and we'd be happy to help you set that up. It's important to consider the wind speed distribution and the wind speed and distribution of the project. So does it skew more toward the low wind? So a low wind speed site is going to be more impacted by curtailment. Whereas a high wind speed site, the effect might not be as dramatic. Pricing is important when you're modeling this, because this, at the end of the day, is a business decision. So is your pricing fixed rate or is it merchant? If it's merchant, meaning it varies, doing a model gets a whole lot more complex. However, it is still doable. And then you need to understand what your curtailment season looks like. Is it a migration season where you're aligning with the bat's migration? Is it year-round? Projects that are closer to the equator might have a longer curtailment season than projects that are more northerly or southerly. And length of day is also important. So if your project is then farther away from the equator, your nights are going to be longer and longer. Nighttime winds are often good production winds, but they might be on the lower side. So it might be right in that sweet spot of where the curtailment is applied. And then there are going to be fixed variables that you really have no control over, but that you need to know. That's your wind turbine make and model and your wind turbine power curve. We can take all of that and plug it into a model. This is an example that I pulled together. This is a project that was actually in South Africa. So their curtailment schedule looks a little bit different for those of you that are in North America. Their curtailment season starts in September. We have the wind speed site parameters. So the shape of the wind speed distribution are the Weibull parameters. We have the height, average wind speed, and then this is using an example V112 wind turbine with a 3 megawatt output. And because the available energy and therefore price in wind is the cubic of wind speed, you see an exponential growth in the amount of lost energy and lost revenue tied to curtailment set point. So if you were picking a 6.5 to 7 meter per second curtailment set point on this project, it could actually be curtailed up to 19% of the time, which looks like about a 2.5% lost AEP and roughly $10,000 a year. So all of these variables can be pulled into your business model to determine whether or not the deterrent or the application of deterrent makes sense. If you were able to use a deterrent on a project like this, it's quite possible you could reduce or eliminate the need for curtailment. So now I'm going to talk about validation of and equipment. So when you're evaluating the use of bat mitigation options at a wind site, many developers might want to know how effective our technology will be. And one way to get a sense of this is to help inform the decision-making process around the adoption of our system is to conduct a validation study. Validation studies are important for not only proving that it's effective at protecting bats, but also for defending your project economics. It is important to note that trials can be costly, time-consuming, and yield lots of data. So I think it's really important that if you're going to do this, that you're investing in a proper study design prior to beginning the study. You need to understand the statistical power of the study. That is an understanding of how likely will the study itself yield statistically significant results. And NRG strongly recommends working with an environmental consultant. So NRG is not an environmental consultant. So we typically do not advise on study design. We're happy to participate and provide equipment and our knowledge and our experience, but we do not do the study design itself. Let's talk about some of the factors that affect efficacy of a study. Mix of bat species is important, depending on where the project is. Some bats are low flyers or high flyers. They may be high frequency bats, low frequency bats. That could impact the efficacy of a study. The time of year is important. We already talked about the power of the study design. So how likely is it to yield statistically significant results? The location is important. Weather can certainly impact a study. If your study is just over a few months versus over 2 or 3 years, that could be a factor. The duration of the study, so the longer the duration, typically the better data you can collect. Searcher efficiency is important if it's a mortality survey. So would be somebody walking along underneath the wind turbine searching for carcasses. How good are they at doing that? Carcass persistence. So also if it's a mortality study, you would want to understand if what's the likelihood that the carcasses you find are the only ones there, or were there some that have already been removed by scavengers. If we're doing a thermal study, what's the camera resolution like? What's the field of view? Can it capture the entire rotor swept area? Wind turbine rotor diameter is important. That would drive both the how many cameras you are using, and also if you're doing a mortality survey, that drives the size of the plot. So a large diameter rotor is going to require a bigger survey area. The topography of the wind farm is important, and the number of wind turbines, both at the wind farm itself and the number of turbines that you're involving in the study between a control and a test group. So I would say there's really 3 types of studies that NRG has been aware of: a mortality study, a thermal or video camera study, and then an acoustic study. I'd say by far the most common study that NRG is aware of is the mortality study. And this is, it often piggybacks on the post-construction monitoring that's already taking place on a wind project. So many wind projects, even if they weren't doing a study like this, would have some sort of requirement to do a number of years of walking underneath wind turbines and collecting bat and bird carcasses. I would say this gives little insight to the actual number of bats present at the wind farm. So we're only collecting what's been hit by the wind turbines. It definitely requires then a control and a test group. So you would want a control group that is set up to be running as the wind project was originally designed, and then your test group would be running the deterrents. There are certainly precedents of peer review for this type of study. There's been several studies that have taken place, and typically the results that yield can be statistically significant. NRG has participated in about 8 of these types of studies. The average number of wind turbines involved in these has been 12. And I'd say the maximum number has been greater than 40. A thermal video study uses thermal cameras or night vision cameras aimed at the rotor swept area. This offers a visual evidence of the bats. It's possible in some ways to eliminate the control group, though not necessarily advisable, meaning you could just do this on one wind turbine. And it can generate a potentially overwhelming amount of data. So depending on your setup, you may be reviewing hours and hours of thermal video to understand if you have bats. It does give you a visual confirmation of the bat behavior. So is the bat really avoiding the airspace? It does allow you to have potentially reduced mortality during the trial period. So if you decided to eliminate the control wind turbines, you've removed the chance that those control turbines are taking bats. I would say it does generate a lot of data and a lot of data processing. It's rare that you'll be able to determine the bat species. I'm aware of 3 studies that NRG has participated in, and the average number of turbines in those studies is between 1 and 3. Lastly, there's the acoustic monitoring. So that's using bat detectors or acoustic microphones mounted on the nacelle or at the base of the wind turbine and listening for the presence of bats. This does provide species-specific data, so that's very useful. But it's come to light over the last few years that not all bats may echolocate all the time. So it's quite possible that you're actually maybe missing some bats. And if you are running the Bat Deterrent System, it's a good chance that it's either going to overpower the detector, or you need to do some fancy filtering to remove the noise of the NRG system itself. It does give you good species identification. It does offer you the ability to reduce the mortality during the trial period, again, because you may not necessarily need to use a control turbine. I'd say some of the cons of this are again, we understand now that not all bats echolocate all the time. And the distance between the bat and the detector is limited. So if the bat is maybe outside of the rotocept area or just inside the rotocept area, it's possible that the detector itself is not picking up that bat. And this does still generate a tremendous amount of data. So if you're running these recorders all night long, somebody or a machine is going to have to go through and identify where in time the bats are and pull that information out. I'm aware of 2 studies that have been done using just acoustic monitoring, and they're usually pretty small, single turbine each. So I thought I would wrap things up here. Again, I think it's important to arm yourself with the tools to understand the economics of the whole. So the cost of the curtailment, the study design. Take the time to evaluate the need to do a study. A lot of owner-operators kind of jump right in, but if maybe there's an opportunity to piggyback on somebody else's work, or maybe your one project's near another project that's already done a study, because again, studies are costly. Make sure your study design will yield statistically significant and actionable data. So you don't want to go through all of this and then come up with a kind of a shoulder shrug. We didn't get enough data to make a decision. So make sure that you've done this study design, or your consultant has done this study design, such that you know that it's going to get you what you need. I do actually I've written a white paper that covers all 3 of these validation methods in a little bit more detail, and includes links to some publicly available studies. And so I'd be happy to invite you to contact NRG and download that white paper. Or if you have any questions, you can reach out to me directly. I thank you for your time today. I look forward to taking questions. Cheers.